It was a darkness so absolute, it felt less like night and more like an inversion of the world. Then a single, impossibly bright spear of light pierced the velvet abyss. Imagine standing on a wind-swept plateau in the American West in the spring of 1843. The air is cold, the only sound the rustle of sagebrush. You look up and see it, not the moon, not a planet, but a celestial river of fire, its tail so vast it seemed to stretch from the western horizon over your head and back into the eastern dawn. It was the great comet of 1843, an astronomical wonder that terrified, mesmerized, and ultimately shaped the destiny of the United States. In the same year this cosmic harbinger blazed across the sky, another, more terrestrial fever began to seize the American mind, the irresistible, all-consuming madness for gold. This is the true story of how a single celestial event, the brightest comet of the 19th century, became inextricably linked in the popular American imagination with the sudden, explosive discovery of gold in California, igniting one of the most transformative, destructive, and astonishing periods in U.S. history, a period defined by cosmic wonder, technological triumph, and moral collapse. The fire in the heavens. The year 1843 was meant to be one of sober reflection for the young American Republic. The nation was still reeling from the panic of 1837, a severe economic depression. The political landscape was a volatile mix of manifest destiny fervor, the divine mission, as many believed, to expand across the continent, and the bitter, festering divide over slavery. Stability was an illusion, but the people craved certainty. Then came the fire. On February 5, 1843, a U.S. naval officer aboard the frigate USS Brandywine, sailing off the coast of Brazil, made the first widely reported sighting. He documented a streak of light so immense and dazzling that the ship's log initially dismissed it as a massive atmospheric anomaly, a freak electrical storm. Within days, however, the phenomenon was undeniable. Astronomers across the globe scrambled to train their new, cumbersome refractors on the object. What they saw was unprecedented. The Great Comet, formerly C/1843 D1, was a sun grazer. It had passed so close to the sun, a mere 83,000 miles from the stellar surface, closer than any object previously recorded, that the solar wind had boiled off its ice, rock, and dust into a tail of unimaginable scale. At its peak, this tail stretched over 200 million miles in length, making it for a time the longest object humanity had ever observed. In the moonless nights of the American South and West, it was a terrifyingly beautiful spectacle, a bright white band of light that cast distinct shadows on the ground. The prophetic fear. For a population still deeply rooted in agrarian life and religious literalism, a comet was never merely a scientific curiosity, it was a prophecy. Across the bustling port cities and the sparsely settled frontier, the interpretations were immediate and stark. A sign of judgment, evangelical preachers declared it the sword of God, a celestial warning against the sin of slavery and the nation's relentless avarice. Pamphlets were distributed in New York and Philadelphia, claiming the comet's tail was a heavenly whip, signaling that the end times were near. The alchemist's fire. More ominously, an undercurrent of folk belief, particularly among prospectors and settlers pushing westward, viewed the comet as an alchemist's agent. The intense heat of its sun-grazing passage, it was rumored, had scattered cosmic gold dust into the atmosphere, which would then settle upon the Earth, perhaps in specific, remote locations. The ancient idea of metallic rain from the heavens, iron from meteorites, for example, was transmuted into the hope for gold. These were not isolated beliefs. They were reported in countless newspapers, from the sophisticated New York Tribune to the crude hand-set presses of frontier towns like St. Louis. The comet became the central topic of discussion, overshadowing political turmoil and economic struggle. It primed the entire American psyche for something extraordinary, something miraculous, or something utterly ruinous. The nation was holding its breath, waiting for the celestial prediction to manifest on Earth. The silent promise of Sutter Mill. Meanwhile, nearly 2,000 miles to the west, in the Mexican territory of Alta California, a man was building a feudal empire that would soon become the epicenter of this prophecy. This was Johann August Sutter, a charismatic but deeply indebted German-Swiss immigrant. He was a man with a genius for self-promotion and an utter disregard for legal or financial boundaries. By 1843, Sutter had established Nueva Helvetia, New Switzerland, a colossal 150,000-acre land grant in the fertile Sacramento Valley. His central fortified compound, known simply as Sutter Fort, was an operational hub, a brewery, a bakery, a tannery, a blacksmith shop, and even the first school and hospital in the region. He ruled with a dictatorial hand, employing hundreds of Native Americans whom he paid in credit at the fourth store, or more often, simply in meager rations and brutal discipline. Sutter's ultimate ambition, however, was not agriculture, it was lumber. He needed timber to expand his fort and build a fleet of river barges to connect his inland empire to the Pacific trade routes. In late 1843, shortly after the comet had faded, Sutter sent his master carpenter, James Wilson, to an isolated spot on the South Fork of the Amica River, about 40 miles northeast of the fort. Marshall was to build a sawmill. Marshall was the antithesis of the grand, flamboyant Sutter. He was a quiet, meticulous New Jersey native, a deeply suspicious man with a reclusive nature. He cared nothing for prophecy, only for the grain of the wood and the smooth running of his mill race. Yet it was in this very obscurity, far removed from the clamor and wonder of the East, that the great comet's promised earthbound fire would finally strike. The grinding gears of fate. The winter of 1847-1848 was harsh. Marshall and his small crew, Native American laborers and a few white journeymen, struggled to complete the mill race, a channel designed to divert water to power the mill wheel. On the night of January 23, 1848, Marshall instructed his crew to open the headgate to the mill race, using the high water flow to scour the channel clean of sediment and debris. The following morning, January 24, 1848, was cold and clear. Marshall performed his habitual, meticulous inspection of the freshly scoured mill race. He was looking for any obstruction, any rock that might foul the wheel. It was just after sunrise when he spotted the glimmer. Half submerged in the cold, running water, catching the thin winter light, was a cluster of shiny specks. Marshall reached down. He pulled out a piece of metal no bigger than a thumbnail, heavier than anything he knew, and unmistakably, gloriously yellow. He tested it with his teeth, as miners had for centuries. It bore the mark. It was soft. He found another piece, and then another. They were not flecks of the cosmic gold dust rumored after the great comet, but solid alluvial gold, the silent, hidden wealth of the Amica River. The event, simple and quiet as it was, marked the true beginning of the gold rush. The news, however, did not explode across the country overnight. It had to cross the same treacherous trails that the American settlers now considered their divine right to own, the same sky the great comet had recently ruled. Marshall was paranoid. Sutter was desperate to keep it secret. Their motives were purely selfish. Marshall wanted the glory, and Sutter wanted to monopolize the strike. They tried to impose an oath of silence on the men at the mill, a futile gesture against the primal human drive for wealth. The secret would hold for less than a month before the dam broke. When it did, the collective memory of the spectacular comet would rush back, cementing in the American mind the grand, dangerous idea. The fire in the sky had delivered a gift to the earth, and it was waiting for them in California.
the race to be ruined. The true discovery that launched the gold rush didn't happen at the mill. It happened on the editorial desk of Samuel Brannan, a former Mormon elder turned savvy San Francisco merchant. Brannan had moved to California in 1846, tasked with bringing a colony of Mormon settlers to the region. He was a man of extraordinary, almost ruthless vision. When the gold rumors began to trickle into his San Francisco store, Brannan, who was already running the California Star, saw not just a potential gold strike, but an unprecedented business opportunity. He didn't want the gold, he wanted to sell the shovels, the pans, the provisions, and the land. In early May 1848, Brannan performed the most pivotal publicity stunt of the era. He traveled to Sutter Fort,
confirmed the strike, and then loaded his pockets with vials of alluvial gold. Returning to San Francisco on May 12, he burst onto the main plaza, holding one of the vials aloft, screaming at the top of his lungs, "Gold! Gold! Gold from the American River!" This single theatrical action was the spark. Before Brannan's outburst, San Francisco was a quiet, dusty port town of about 1,000 residents. Within a week, it was a ghost town. Shopkeepers abandoned their stores, sailors deserted their ships, soldiers walked away from their posts, and farmers left their fields half-plowed. The fever was instantaneous and total. The news then began its epic, multi-stage journey across the continent, traveling along the fastest lines of communication available. The sea route, summer 1848. The first confirmed reports reached the East Coast via ships sailing from California to Panama, crossing the isthmus, and then catching another ship to New York or Boston. The journey took up to 5 months. The official word, December 1848. Crucially, President James K. Polk announced the discovery in his annual address to Congress on December 5, 1848. Polk's statement, based on a sealed official report from Colonel Richard Barnes Mason, the military governor of California, included a sensational, irrefutable detail. The accounts of the abundance of gold in that territory are of such an extraordinary character as would scarcely command belief were they not corroborated by the authentic reports of officers in the public service. Polk then displayed a tea caddy full of gold dust and nuggets. This was the final authority the American public needed. The great comet's fiery portent had been validated by the President of the United States. The exodus of the 49ers. What followed was not just a migration, but a cataclysmic national reshuffling. In 1849, over 80,000 people, later nicknamed the 49ers, swelled the trails, rivers, and seas heading to California. This was a movement of people unlike any before, mostly young, single men, driven by a profound, almost religious conviction that they were destined for instant riches. They faced 3 perilous routes, each a crucible of suffering and death. The overland route, the California Trail, a 2,000-mile march across the plains and Rockies, battling disease, cholera was rampant, starvation, brutal weather, and intergroup conflict. The journey took 5 to 6 months. The trail was famously littered with abandoned possessions, books, pianos, farm equipment, discarded to lighten the load for the oxen and mules. The detritus of civilization lined the route of savage ambition. The Panama route, the fastest but most expensive option. This involved a sea voyage to the disease-ridden Isthmus of Panama, a treacherous crossing through the jungle, and a long wait for a ship on the Pacific side. It was a route that offered a quick fortune in gold or a quick grave from malaria or yellow fever. The Cape Horn route, a 6 to 8 month, 18,000-mile circumnavigation of South America, braving the treacherous waters off Cape Horn. It was a test of endurance that few poorly built gold rush vessels could reliably pass. In the midst of this unprecedented, voluntary self-destruction, one astonishing fact emerged.
By 1850, California, a former Mexican territory barely 2 years under American control, would host over 300,000 new inhabitants, a population explosion that would force its statehood and permanently tilt the American balance of power toward the West. But the real story of the gold rush is not the gold found. It is the civilization lost, the moral compass broken, and the dark, astonishing transformation of the American soul. The narrative would then continue to explore the collapse of law and order, the genocide against Native Americans, the technological shift from panning to hydraulic mining, the rise of San Francisco, and the eventual paradox of Sutter and Marshall dying poor, while the merchants who sold the supplies became the new American aristocracy.
The giant monitors. The pressurized water was channeled into massive, heavy-duty nozzles known as monitors or giants. These iron cannons could fire a jet of water with tremendous force, sometimes reaching pressures of 300 feet per second, powerful enough to kill a man at close range and capable of tearing apart bedrock. The result: the jet was directed against the high banks of gold-bearing earth. The resultant mud, rock, and gravel, called slickens, slid down into elaborate sluice boxes lined with mercury to trap the fine gold. This process yielded immense wealth, extracting gold that was previously unattainable. Between 1853 and 1884, hydraulic mining was responsible for extracting nearly $100 million in 19th century dollars worth of gold. The environmental catastrophe. However, the wealth came at an apocalyptic cost. The comet's promised bounty turned into an ecological nightmare, revealing the darkest side of unchecked American ambition. Slickens and sedimentation. The sheer volume of debris, billions of cubic yards of earth, washed into the river systems. This slickens permanently raised the riverbeds, choking channels, causing massive flooding in the Central Valley, destroying valuable farmlands, and rendering navigable rivers useless for shipping. Mercury poisoning. The use of mercury to amalgamate or trap the fine gold was widespread. Much of this mercury was lost into the sediment, leading to long-term mercury contamination of California's waterways, which persists in localized areas even today. The landscape. Vast sections of the Sierra Nevada foothills were left as desolate, lunar-like landscapes, sheer cliffs of exposed bedrock where hills once stood. The conflict between the powerful mining interests and the rapidly growing agricultural industry in the valley culminated in the landmark Woodruff versus North Bloomfield Mining and Gravel Company 1884 case. The subsequent court injunction effectively banned hydraulic mining in California, setting a critical precedent for environmental regulation in the United States, even if the damage was already irreparable. The cost of the prophecy, a moral and demographic ruin. The gold rush did more than just transform the landscape. It fundamentally reshaped the demography and morality of the emerging American West, often with horrifying cruelty. The pursuit of wealth created a chaotic, lawless frontier that preyed upon the most vulnerable. The collapse of law and order. Vigilante justice. Due process was rare. Cases were frequently settled by vigilante committees, which, while sometimes effective at curbing crime, often devolved into xenophobic mobs executing judgment on flimsy evidence, particularly against minorities. The foreign miners tax. As gold became scarce, resentment against non-American miners exploded. California passed the Foreign Miners Tax of 1850, primarily targeting Mexican and Chinese miners. This tax was discriminatory, extortionate, and violently enforced, driving out or enslaving thousands of non-white prospectors. The Chinese community, in particular, became the victim of decades of systemic violence, disenfranchisement, and organized mob attacks. The genocide of native Californians. Perhaps the darkest chapter of the gold rush is the genocide of the native Californian populations. Before 1848, the indigenous population was estimated to be around 150,000. Within 2 decades, this population was reduced by nearly 80%. The miners' need for land, water, and resources directly conflicted with native livelihood, leading to a deliberate campaign of extermination. Extermination campaigns. The state of California directly funded and organized militias, often euphemistically called volunteer companies, whose explicit purpose was to massacre native villages. The state reimbursed these companies for their supplies and expenses, effectively subsidizing genocide. Debt slavery. The 1850 Act for the Government and Protection of Indians was a state law that legalized the forced labor and effective debt slavery of native people. This law allowed white settlers to indenture native children and adults on the thinnest of pretexts. Loss of land and culture. Mining operations destroyed traditional food sources, such as salmon spawning grounds and acorn groves, forcing survivors into starvation and dependence on the mercy, or lack thereof, of the settlers. The gold rush cemented an astonishing paradox. The fire in the sky had inaugurated an unparalleled era of wealth and expansion for the American nation. But for those caught under the stampede, it delivered only ruin and death. It was the moment the United States cemented its identity as a nation willing to sacrifice anything, morality, law, and human life, for the sake of economic destiny. John Sutter, the ambitious Swiss magnate who owned the land, desperately tried to keep the discovery a secret. He feared, correctly, that a massive influx of miners would destroy the carefully constructed semi-feudal empire of Nueva Helvetia. The onslaught. Sutter's fears materialized instantly. His fort became a way station and a source of provisions for thousands of incoming miners. His Native American laborers, hearing the news, abandoned his fields and shops to search for gold themselves, crippling his agricultural operations. Squatter sovereignty. Sutter's vast land grants were legally complex, rooted in Mexican law. American miners, guided by the principle of squatter sovereignty and the belief that the government should not interfere with a man's right to mine, simply ignored his claims. They seized his land, butchered his livestock, stole his equipment, and even dismantled his fort for building materials. Legal battles. Sutter spent the remainder of his life embroiled in complex legal battles trying to reassert ownership over his land. He secured a temporary massive victory in 1855 when the U.S. District Court confirmed his title to a colossal 22 square leagues of land. However, this triumph was immediately shattered by the land riots of 1855 in Sacramento, fueled by angry squatters. The Supreme Court later overturned the decision, confirming only a small portion of his original grant. Sutter died in 1880 in Lititz, Pennsylvania, impoverished and petitioning Congress for restitution. The founder of the gold rush's epicenter, who had briefly held the potential to be the wealthiest man in America, became a mere historical footnote, eclipsed by the merchants and lawyers who profited from the chaos. Marshall's decline. The prophet unheard. James Marshall, the quiet, methodical carpenter who first saw the gold, also suffered a tragic, self-inflicted decline. Paranoia and isolation. Marshall's personality was ill-suited for the chaotic environment the gold rush created. He became intensely paranoid, convinced that everyone was trying to steal his legitimate claims or murder him for his supposed knowledge of secret gold veins. He took to drinking heavily and wandering the foothills, sometimes claiming to possess supernatural powers to locate gold, a reflection of the era's fusion of science and mysticism. Failure to profit. Unlike the savvy merchants like Samuel Brannan, Marshall possessed no business acumen. His attempts to mine his original discovery site were thwarted by squatters and legal disputes. He was repeatedly cheated out of his modest claims. The final years. Marshall spent his final years bitter and penniless. The state of California eventually granted him a small pension in the 1870s, but it was inconsistently paid. He lived in a tiny cabin, supported largely by the charity of his friends, and died alone in 1885. Marshall and Sutter represent the profound, ironic truth of the gold rush. The men who found the fire did not control it. The true winners were those who sold the tools, controlled the transportation, and administered the law. The infrastructure that tamed, regulated, and profited from the collective human madness. The comet of 1843 arrived at the precise moment of maximum fervor for the Millerite movement, one of the most significant American religious phenomena of the 19th century. The prophecy, founded by New York farmer and Baptist preacher William Miller, the movement predicted that Christ would return to earth between March 1843 and March 1844. Miller based his prediction on a complex interpretation of the Book of Daniel, specifically the 2300-day prophecy. The comet as the sign. When the incredibly bright, sword-like comet of 1843 appeared, visible even near the sun, Millerites across the nation interpreted it as the absolute divine sign that Miller's prophecy was coming true. The comet, for them, was the messenger of God's judgment. The great disappointment. The promised date passed without the second coming. This event became known as the Great Disappointment, causing massive emotional and spiritual upheaval and leading to the eventual formation of the Adventist movement. However, the psychological impact was crucial. For those disillusioned by the religious prophecy, the subsequent discovery of unimaginable wealth in California offered a tantalizing earthly manifestation of the comet's promise. The celestial fire had not signaled the end of the world, but the beginning of a new world of wealth. It was a swift, secular transfer of faith, from salvation in heaven to instant riches on earth. The birth of Western meteorology. Ironically, the same celestial phenomena that fueled superstition also catalyzed American science. The need to understand weather and climate became an economic imperative for the vast movement of people and goods to California. The clipper ship era. The fastest way to transport mail, perishable goods, and wealthy passengers between the coasts was the clipper ship, capable of navigating the Cape Horn route. Captains raced the clock, and their success depended entirely on predicting winds and currents. This led to a huge demand for accurate, reliable meteorological data. Matthew Fontaine Maury, the father of oceanography and hydrographer to the U.S. Navy, began systematically collecting thousands of ship logs. By charting wind and current patterns globally, he produced his revolutionary winds and current charts. These charts drastically cut the transit time to California, sometimes by weeks, making the long sea route viable and immensely profitable. Maury's scientific endeavor was directly spurred by the gold rush demand for faster routes. A national system. This era of data collection led directly to the first major attempts to establish a national weather observation system in the United States, recognizing that scientific data was crucial for economic and maritime security. The comet, therefore, acted as a cosmic mirror. It simultaneously reflected the deepest, most fear-driven superstitions of 19th century America, while forcing the nation to embrace data-driven science as the only reliable tool for controlling the environment and securing economic advantage. The final dust. The legacy of failure and the myth of the West. By the 1860s, the gold rush was largely over. The easy alluvial gold was gone, and the extraction industry had shifted fully into the hands of corporations and complex hard rock mining operations
requiring vast capital. The remaining solo miners were left with a grim reality: the failure rate. The enduring American myth is that the gold rush created countless fortunes. The sober reality is that the vast majority of 49ers, perhaps as many as 9 out of 10, either failed to make any significant money or quickly lost what they found through reckless spending, inflation, disease, or theft. Debt and disease, thousands of migrants arrived in California heavily indebted, having borrowed money for passage or supplies. They often succumbed to cholera or dysentery before reaching the gold fields, or died of malnutrition and exposure in the harsh mining camps. The cost of living, as noted earlier, the staggering inflation meant that even moderate success was quickly eaten up by living expenses. A miner might dig $5 of gold a day, only to spend $4.50 on food and supplies. The great irony is that the true fortunes were not made by those who sought the gold, but by those who never touched a shovel: the merchants, the bankers, Leland Stanford, Mark Hopkins, the transportation moguls, Cornelius Vanderbilt, and the service providers, Sam Brannan. These men leveraged the miners' hope, the expectation created by the Great Comet and the national fervor, to build sustainable institutional wealth. The enduring myth of the West. Despite the factual record of failure and ruin, the gold rush forged the powerful and enduring myth of the American West. The self-made man. The myth celebrates the individual who battles nature and circumstance to achieve destiny through grit and independence. It neatly glosses over the systemic violence, environmental destruction, and corporate consolidation that actually defined the era. The eternal frontier. The gold rush solidified California not just as a place, but as a concept. The place where the limits of possibility are always being pushed, where the next boom is always imminent, and where the nation's future is perpetually being invented. The spectacular light of the Great Comet of 1843 and the flash of gold in Marshall's hands provided the origin story for this myth, a thrilling tale of divine intervention and human audacity. It was an event that catalyzed a massive national migration, birthed a modern metropolis, destroyed indigenous civilizations, created American environmental law, and left a permanent, restless hunger for instant success in the American soul. The spirit of the fire in the sky, wild, beautiful, and utterly destructive, continues to define the spirit of the West.